Everybody today for the latest in our Hydroterra webinar series. It's great to have so many attendees. It's fantastic, in fact. Today, the topic we're looking at is rehydrating Australia's landscape, the productivity and environmental benefits. Next slide, thanks, Michelle. So our presenter today is Luke Peel from the Malune Institute. Malune Institute has a research farm, or a few farms actually, up out of Canberra. Luke will talk more to that. Hydroterra has been heavily involved with the Malune Institute over the last 3 years, designing their monitoring system and working with them about looking at indicators of catchment health and a whole range of things around designing a monitoring system specification and that sort of thing as well. And it's been a real pleasure to work with them. We really believe in the Malune Institute's aims and their passion for rehabilitating Australia's landscape. And we have signed an MOU with them to collaborate on helping to spread the word about their practices and work closely with them, culminating in this webinar, for example. So behind the scenes, we've got Michelle keeping us on track today, and I'm Richard Campbell, Managing Director of Hydroterra. So next slide, thank you. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, I'll do a little bit of an introduction about how you can interact with this webinar. Then we pass over to Luke, who's going to talk about the Malune Rehydration Initiative, which is their large research site out of Canberra, the various research themes that they're looking at, some of the preliminary findings from the research they've already done, also looking at some of the fantastic outcomes that they've already witnessed in terms of biodiversity, and then also looking at the somewhat daunting aspect of the challenges we face as a nation in terms of preserving our native species and increasing the productivity of our land. Next slide, thank you. Okay, so a really important part of these webinars is questions from yourselves. Our speakers really love to get your questions. And in order for you to make a question, you click on the Q&A button on your screen and type in there. At the end of the session, I will read out those questions and Luke and myself will hopefully be able to answer those for you. So looking forward to getting some questions as well. Next slide, please. So Luke and myself have been working together now for quite a long time. I've been really impressed with the breadth of his knowledge in terms of natural resource management. You would have seen in the introduction, what he's done in terms of a description of his works, but I could probably summarise that as he has a very broad understanding of natural systems, which is also complemented by a very strong understanding of spatial data, which has allowed him to work for various natural resource management agencies in the Northern Territory, and then later on with the Murray-Darling Basin Authority, for example. What I've found really impressive is Luke's passion for embracing new technology, and he certainly has a very strong understanding of how to use various satellite-based spatial data sets to measure natural resource systems. And it's been great for Hydroterra to learn some of that from Luke. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Luke, and I think we're very lucky to have him here to share his knowledge on the Malune Research Initiative. Thanks, Luke.
Thank you, Richard. Very kind words, and thank you for that.
Luke, you'll need to, oh yeah, that's it.
There we go. So thanks, Richard, and also extend that to the Hydroterra team for inviting me to present this webinar. Firstly, I'd like to pay my respects to the First Nations people of the Ngunnawal and Yuin country, past, present and future generations that cover where I live in Canberra, and the Yuin country for where the Malone Institute's research and catchment scale project is conducted. And that's extended then to all the First Nations people where our audience are located respectively. Also like to acknowledge the very generous and visionary efforts by Mr. and Mrs. Tony Coote for providing much of the resources and drive that established the Malone Institute and this project, and backed by seed funding by Vincent Fairfax Family Foundation, Southeast LLS, and of course the very extensive support by other partners, particularly ANU, led by Professor Steve Dovers. There are plenty of others that have also provided input, but it'd be a long list to go through them all, so apologies. The Malone Institute is a small group, but it's also punches well above its weight, but it does require and looks forward to the partnerships that we've built and the collaborations that we do, because that's how we're going to get through all of this. So the Malone Institute, we pride ourselves in establishing ourselves as Australia's premier scientific organisation in the landscape rehydration space. We are a not-for-profit. We do actively demonstrate, monitor and inform on those rehydration practices that we'll talk about. And Richard alluded to the 2 farms that we do have in the catchment that are operational farms in their own right. What do? Well, we're certainly all about water, the water quality and water quantity, but it extends into this integrated view of the landscape of the soil and the plants, the biodiversity of flora and fauna. It even goes down to the microfauna and biology in the soil. That also links in with our carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle. In doing so, all these components put together and the actions that we're going to talk about today has really shown signs that we can build resilience to drought, flood and fire, and climate extremes, and moderate those effects. We're also recognised by the UN's Sustainable Development Solutions Network as one of 5 projects, and we're certainly very excited to be part of this group and recognised for the work that we're doing, and hope that we can actually provide some solutions to the many 17 goals that they're trying to work on globally, and how the work here we do locally can be informing that. So why is water key to reducing this climate change? Now, there's a whole subject matter on here, so I'm just summarise these key points here. But water is a major regulator of climate. I mean, when we talk about droughts, we're always looking to the sky for rain, and that rain is driven by the water cycle, the large water cycle. But there's also the smaller water cycle at the local scale, and that is connected to those carbon and nitrogen cycles as well. But water is that planetary thermostat, and even with those elevated greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, water is essential to managing the biosphere and addressing the feedback loops in our climate system. So, of course, good water management is critical. And the water cycle can have a dramatic and positive influence in successfully addressing these drought, floods, soil health, food production and climate, as I'll go on to explain. Of course, the other part of the on-ground project is the works managed by Peter Hazel, project coordinator, and Max, who you see here, doing an astounding job, but also backed with other staff who have also assisted, Bill McAllister and Anne Gibson and many others as well, acknowledging them. So the Malone Rehydration Initiative, which is based 40 minutes east of Canberra. It's just outside of Bungendore, and we're effectively on the eastern side of the Great Dividing Range. In fact, the property that we have is split by the Great Dividing Range. You can see that red line over here. If I just pointer options. There's the Great Dividing Range running along through here. And this is our main property here, the home farm. This is where the pilot project was initiated in 2006, along with great support from partners, Tarwin Park Training, with Peter Andrews, who led that. And they're a major partner with the education and training aspects of what we've been doing here at the Maloon Institute, and often run training programs. The rest of the catchment and landholders come through here. This is Maloon Creek, starting up at Telaganda National Park. And we've got Sandhills Creek here, another major tributary, again, just east of the Great Dividing Range. It flows in and has a confluence with Maloon Creek before it exits out and becomes Reedy Creek at this point, and goes down into the Shoalhaven. We've got 20 landholders. We're trying to address 50 kilometres of creeks and tributaries over a 23,000 hectare catchment. And you can get an idea of the array of instrumentation that we've got, that we've already established. And to top this off, there's soil moisture sensors that are also started to go in as well. So I mentioned that our partnership with ANU, but also many other of our partners that form up the Maloon Institute Science Advisory Committee. And with that, an extensive stakeholder engagement since 2012, since the inception of TMI, that helped understand what were the key questions that would actually help identify what it is that we wanted to or needed to study and get results on. With that, we've described 4 pillars of research themes: land and water functionality, ecological biodiversity functionality, the economic cost benefit analysis, and that includes not only the a farm productivity, but trying to incorporate natural capital, economic cost benefit, the co-benefits, and of course the community outcomes, because this is quite a social aspect as well, about bringing the community along, bringing subject matter experts, local subject matter experts, including our Indigenous First Nation people also, who have the ability to be able to read the landscape and have worked with this landscape and understand how it functions, and what we could learn from that to still be able to have viable farming to produce food and fibre for what we need in this day and age. Initial findings that we've had: 60% increase in stock carrying capacity on the floodplain within 5 years of the initial interventions at Maloon Creek Home Farm. We've had a dramatic improvement in the volume of water and the quality of water leaving the farm. We've also generated resilience to the droughts and floods, and we've with an extreme drought that we've just had recently, but remembering that when we initiated this in 2006, we're in the middle of the millennial drought. We've had a significant improvement in our biodiversity and habitat. We've increased our green surface area, which, if we talk about the small water cycle, the green surface area, or the volume of biomass, plants, trees, grass, shrubs, they are all the biotic pumps that help drive that small water cycle. Also provide the habitat, and in the cases of farm productivity, the farm production that is required. But we've also created this microclimate where we can also moderate those extreme heats of summer that we get in the area, as well as creating a warmer winter by the effect of the extra water cycling going on locally, and overall a much healthier environment. Give you a bit of a view of what that means. A few pictures now. This is what a few of the sites of after these interventions. In fact, the bioengineering, we could call it, that the plants then take over. We intervene to try and stop the erosive degrading process that was happening, that was eroding out the creek beds and making the water flow faster. We understand where these natural steps are in the waterway, where the inputs are that are coming into the creek, and where a placement of an intervention would go, a leaky weir for another term, and then allow biology to come and take over and help then maintain these structures and work with the system to further slow it down, create the habitat, filter the water and slow it down even further. And the examples of what has occurred has really been quite extraordinary. yes, it does. We try and source as much local materials, rocks and logs. So we're trying to not bring in too many other external factors, that we're trying to bring in local. This is what we can generate. And by even doing so, this hasn't stopped the fish passage or other fauna getting through along the creek lines. We're working with fisheries in New South Wales as well. And it seems to be that these natural systems working this way is what the native plants and fauna have adapted to. So Peters Pond, just to give you a bit of an overview of just how much you can regenerate the system. It's another example of where we've now moved down further into the creek at one of the other land holdings. Working with these landholders has been fantastic. We can't do it without them. And this series of photos is October 2019. We're still in the drought. We've actually had just a small shower before that. This is in December when the structure was completed, and we've had another little bit of rain. This is in February, so 2020. So this is how quickly you can turn these systems around to, not to be flippant, but just add water. It is one of the critical drivers. Water is life, but it also, water in the landscape helps generate life. It's not just about in the floodplains and the creeks as well. The principles of what we're doing of slowing the flow down, in the case of the creek, trying to get it to spread out naturally as it would do on the floodplains and recharge those aquifers. Similarly, even at the top of this ridge line, which is just only the next ridge line down from the Great Dividing Range, which you can see in the background there. But even these ridge lines, right from the top down onto the floodplains, everything counts. And so here, Tarwin Park Training ran a course and helped in demonstrating what to do while training at the same time. We've been able to create a leaky contour where it slows that water down, gets the water down into the soil rather than just continuing to run off and down that slope. And that slope and the going off there in the distance is easily a 30 to 40 degree slope. And yet these contours and then the tree plantings have really created this infiltration capability. And within 3 years, we've had phenomenal growth. In fact, in the background there's a two-step leaky weir system. The one that's the second one, closer to where the drop-off is, has, fills from as overflow from the one above it. But the one above was very strategically placed by, again, understanding, reading the landscape. And what ended up happening is that it was put in 2018, and the shower of water that we got filled it, and it has stayed filled even throughout the drought period, the extreme drought that we had right through to the end of 2019. It has maintained water there, and even though the one below it will fill, but then the water will infiltrate, and it does go dry at times. It's still doing its job, but the one above has stayed with water. And we have not intervened with plants there, but I can assure you that there are wetland species, particularly your sedges or cyperus, that have taken over and have naturally occurred. So when you rebuild and restabilize and rehydrate these systems and understand where these steps are in the landscape, you can really promote the vegetation, the biology to come back in. And we've noticed this in the major step diffusion system that we've got at Home Farm, that within a year of building it across a period of 2017 through to 2018, that the frogs have moved back in, the bird life has moved in. So rebuilding these systems, habitat attracts the flora, the fauna to come back in. And it helps promote and rebuild and get the diversity going, and it continues to strengthen. So where does Hydroterra also fit in? As Richard mentioned, he and I have been working on this, and with the funding that we got from Landcare, in particular through the department's federal funding of the Smart Farms, it has really helped us to be able to now put in place much of what we've had planning, because the resourcing to do such a thing is quite extensive, and the requirements do take a fair bit of dollars, and we could certainly do with some more. But here's what we can do, and the monitoring plan and system specifications, my hat off to Richard and his team, but particularly Richard, who has driven this And through our combined network of subject matter experts, but particularly Richard's hard work to pull this together that covers everything from all the large-scale design right down to the details of metadata and naming conventions and data management. I am very excited to have Hydroterra as part of this team, because without them, it's a major step in the right direction. So as an example, we've got 2 major climate stations. These are a step up from the standard weather station. 31 soil moisture sites are being implemented, 6 stream gauges, 70 groundwater piezometers. We've also been doing a heap of monitoring with our other partners, Cybo Labs, with our satellite monitoring products, and the extensive flora and fauna monitoring that we're doing with frogs and birds and fish, LFA transects, or landscape function analysis transects devised by David Tongway, and the rapid assessment and riparian condition, just to name a few of the key factors that we're doing. An example of the climate station that we're doing here, it has the classic temperature, relative humidity, wind speed and direction, but also incoming and outgoing solar radiation. We've also got a heat flux plate. We're trying to understand the heat dynamics of the energy coming in from the sun, how much is reflected back, how much is absorbed and transferred into the system, and where does this energy go? And how do we understand how this system works? Because this relates to how do we understand what's going on with our climate and the climate extremes, and what are we doing here, and how does it inform the effect that we're having on the local climate, and what it potentially is doing to our feeding into the climate change scenario. Soil moisture sensors, I mean, these have only just gone in recently, and we had quite a nice little rainfall event, but then a flood event. And up in here is where we can see that recharge. So this is down at 1.5 meters, but they're position these sensors at 10, 30, 50, 80, and meter 10 and a meter 50. We can see the recharge that happens and the rate of that recharge and the depth of it. The interesting thing was the recharge that happened at this lower depth. We hope that what we'll be doing is be able to connect that up with the piezometers to show the linkage between where this water goes, where the recharge happens. Even recently, after that flood event, what we were also picking up in the top 10 centimeter sensor was this very slight diurnal flux that speaks about how the small water cycle, or indicates the small water cycle at work, where we have the dew fall, that it's just a slight recharge, and then the plants can be the biotic pumps for the day, and hopefully the small water cycle, if you've got good leaf area index, the more dew you attract. And we can see that slight rise and fall on a diurnal basis there. All early indications. Hydroterra have been working with us to collate our telemetered stream gauge data, which has a range of sensors on it. This one's level, and we can see that, the 6 sensors that we saw from the top of the catchment right through to the bottom. Also this Sandhills one here, the pink one here. This one here in particular is just before the confluence with the Maloon. So it's an input. We're trying to measure what is the input coming from that. And it's a very interesting creek, because there's slightly different input that comes from this one. We can see the relative similarities of the pulses that come through and how it flows down through the system, the timing of it, and the peaks and troughs. Now, what these leaky weirs fundamentally are doing is that instead of these peaks being really high peaks and then dropping straight back down to zero, which is what we were finding because the system would drain so quickly, we've slowed that water up and we've maintained water through the system, through the dry times, and it tops up again with these smaller inputs. It's the major flow events where it overtops that really recharges the floodplains. Here we're looking at salt, and this again, this is where we can see that there is a bit of a salt influx that comes in from the Sandhills catchment. We know that there is a slightly different soil there, but we also the hydrogeology that sits behind or underneath this that allows this salt pulse to come through. However, you note it's still just under the World Health regulations, and yet the rest of the EC levels in the rest of the creek are well below what are deemed safe levels. I mentioned the satellite monitoring that we're doing and partnering with Cybo Labs, fantastic products that they've been generating to look at total standing dry matter. There's our floodplain here and the hill slopes and up onto the Great Dividing Range. Over here, looking at the non-green versus bare versus the green pasture growth. So there's a real mixture of trying to understand trees, shrubs, pasture, and where our bare ground is. The interesting thing that we've been able to do also is that they tap into the 30 plus years of time series data set that goes back to the Landsat. So it allows us that our baseline has automatically extended back. Very valuable in terms of understanding what have we measured so far and what are we seeing today, and being able to monitor that, coupled with the Sentinel, that we get a 10-day response. I'm able to provide as a product and a link to all our landholders that they can tap into and be able to monitor their own properties, gauge what they're doing from their land use and land management from a day-to-day, but more likely from a week-to-week basis, and help get that feedback loop and give it a spatial context as well. So the Maloon Institute, we are certainly working at various scales. Here we are at the local scale, we would call it, the catchment scale, the Maloon catchment, but fundamentally, the principles behind this can address a lot of the global problems. And these global agricultural problems are very well documented, whether it's food production that we need to increase to meet the demand, or the industrial farming practices that have in the past that we've seen have had a negative impact, whether we're talking about pesticides and herbicides or soil erosion, that we're actually also dealing with less rainfall. Well, in Australia, we're already living in a continent that's recognised as being the driest habited continent. So water is really important for us, especially when it only makes up, fresh water only makes up 2.5% of the world's water. And 1/3 of our planet is severely degraded, and that we lose so much soil to erosion. So the examples of what we've shown, even with the leaky contours, slowing that water down and reducing erosion, but even encouraging more plant growth that helps protect the soil and slow down the rate of erosion. But also, even at these different steps with the leaky weirs, that as the floodplains have always operated before they were drained, or as the water was just rushing through and taking resources with it, that if we can slow that down and spill that out in the floodplains, we can actually rebuild those floodplains and get them to function and deposit the silt and the nutrients back onto the floodplains as they've always done. And we're dealing with the biodiversity issues, and we've had some very good results so far. So the challenges we face, well, water is one of the biggest ones, and we've already seen water scarcity in our own country, Australia, but also around the world, and particularly having fresh water that has the quality that is potable and usable by not only humans, but also our stock and for irrigations where needs be. So if we don't deal with the water issues, and so we talk about, you've heard me talk about rehydration, well, the opposite to that is if we keep degrading and dehydrating the land, then that leads to desertification. And we know where that leads to. So we need to turn this around, and water will help drive that, but it is also part of the triangle of doing it to encourage plants that help protect the soil, rebuild the soil, get the soil fertility going through microbes and nutrient cycling, which also then, in the wise words of Walter Jenner, for every 1 part of extra soil carbon that you can get back into the soil, you can increase your water holding capacity by 8 to 10 times. So there's a lot of good reasons why we need to look at the water and the nutrient cycle and the carbon cycle. It's all integrated in this systems thinking. This is the way that we're going to be able to not only be able to feed the world and the fibre that's required, but also be able to have the water resources that is required for people's consumption and industrial use. So soil and erosion is another big issue. It's high on the UN SDSN requirements, and that we lose so much soil. This also leads to some of the problems that we've been seeing with the Great Barrier Reef, with the amount of soil or silt that ends up on the reef, but also the soil that runs down and fills up small and large dams and reducing their capacity, reducing their and increasing possible problems with blue-green algae blooms and water quality issues that cost money to fix. We've got a naturally filtering system here that can do a lot of the work, do a lot of the heavy lifting, not only in that result, but also for all our producers. And so that linkage of the poor soil and water management can turn the land from a carbon sink to a carbon source. And this is where we can really work with getting our carbon sink, the soil, and our plants to start extracting more of the carbon dioxide out of our atmosphere. And the more that we protect that soil and nurture that soil, the more that we're able to manage our water, not only to enhance the plant growth, but as a filtering system, because the water still will eventually go through the soil, the hydrological regolith system, and interact with the stream, and then it's filtered, and by then the water that's leaving the property is then in as good, if not better, condition to the next downstream users, whoever they are. So simply, the solution is right under our feet of how we deal with this, and we need to restore that balance. The soil, water, plant triangle, the balance with biodiversity, flora and fauna, and how we actually deal with the increase in the energy or heat that is heating up our climate, and creating those extremes that we're seeing. And we seem to be getting more and more of these climate extremes, and they seem to be getting more extreme. So we need to be able to modify and regulate that. So the Maloon Institute, from this, we've built this network, and we're actively now in 5 project areas, as you can see there, in Western Australia, North Queensland, in Southern New South Wales, and we're actively working on solidifying other projects in these other areas indicated. And we're certainly looking to work with more project areas. We work on adapting the principles of what we do here, and that they can be applied to many other parts of the country, even globally. And working with the local landholders and the local subject matter experts, including our Indigenous First Nation people, it's driven by the community, and where we come in and bring also our partners to help understand what are the actions that need to be undertaken, how does it fit and be adapted to that region and those local situations, and fit in with what is the landholders or stakeholders' desired outcomes. And so it is really at a property scale, but also at a catchment scale, where this works the best, because we notice that we get much better benefits when we all work together. And so in summary, the Maloon Institute works on improved water quality, and we're reducing the impact of climate change. We're certainly moderating against climate extremes by improving that drought resilience and preparedness, and improving farmers' productivity and profitability. We've also increased the biodiversity, healthier ecosystems. And by doing this, we're also then increasing the healthier, nutrient-dense food, which leads to a healthier human beings, which also has an impact, dare I say it, on the cost of our health systems. There are so many co-benefits linked to all of this. And of course, there's the economic, social and economic benefits, whether we're talking about regional townships that prosper from the extra productivity, the extra profitability, the healthier landscape that helps attract not only tourists, but also to encourage people to look at even living in those regions. I have to say thank you again to Richard, and if you would need to contact us. So I'll just part with this and saying that we're a small team. We work on that, we have partnerships and collaborations, and that we're building this extensive monitoring program. We certainly need more resources to help even make this monitoring even more extensive, but we also need the research capability. So I call out to those people who have got resources who would like to be involved with this project, and the researchers to also be involved in analysing and reporting on the data that's being collected. And you can connect through to us through these links. And I believe that we're going to share this presentation. There's a link here for one of our videos. We've also got a YouTube site that with many other educational and informative videos that have been put together. I thank you very much for your time.
Well, thanks very much, Luke, for an excellent presentation on what the Malone Institute's up to. I think in summary, before I move to the Q&A questions, the key message here is that solutions can be simple, and you know, fundamentally what the Malone Institute does is a simple approach. You retain the water in the catchments, and then biodiversity returns, and the more you spread that water and recharge those catchments, the more resilience they have to the variability that we're now faced in terms of climate change. Why? Because there's more water for those plants to draw upon. What I've noticed, having worked with the Malone Institute for a while, is there's actually a lot of government support for this side of things, and there's a lot of international support for this as well. Luke, I'm not sure that you mentioned the United Nations classification that's been applied to the Malone Institute. So perhaps before we get started with these questions, do you want to just explain a little bit about that United Nations program and the classification that the Malone Institute's site has on it?
Yeah, so we're involved with, there's 4 other projects, you know, in the United States and China, South America and the UK, where we're working with the UN, but there are the 17 SDSNs, and I think we comfortably tick off on 8 of those, and there's about 5 others that we have a significant influence with. And so we've been allocated a partnership role. There's no funding involved. There's many other projects that they need to throw resources towards, particularly in the third world countries, which they do a fantastic job of doing. But it does give us the linkage with many of these other projects, and we're hoping that the results from this and many of the principles can be adapted to these other regions across the world as well. So it's really, it's not an actively funded connection, but it is certainly one that gives us some a high level of recognition and interest in what we're doing.
So Luke, just before we move to questions, what does the SDSN stand for?
The Sustainable Development Solutions Network, that UN had identified 17 critical items such as water quality, water availability, food health, ecosystem health, human health, less soil erosion, better resilience to droughts or climate extremes, and climate change. Building that resilience, trying to reduce the impact so that we're not going through this crash and boom cycle, and try and take that crash and boom out. Very similar to what I was even describing with even what we've done simply even in the creek with the stream bed implementation of the leaky weirs, is to take that crash and boom out and moderate that energy that's coming down the system, and with that carrying away those resources. So David Tongway would describe it that the more you have a leaky landscape, the more you're leaking resources. Walter Yano described it well, that our landscape used to work really well, that for every 10 raindrops that fell on the ground, 9 would soak in and only maybe 1 would run off or evaporate. We've turned that around, and we're now 9 raindrops in every 10 run off or evaporate, and only 1 barely sinks in and does any benefit. So again, when a landscape system, an ecosystem fails, it soon degrades and eventually will become a desert, and we need to rehydrate, which is the opposite to desertification.
Okay, thanks, Luke. We might move to these questions. So one from Giuseppe Greco. What is the most difficult challenge when it comes to using satellite data and comparing it with field data?
Yeah, it's a good question, Giuseppe. Having done many years of doing the research and development up in the northern dry tropics and savanna lands, it does take a fair bit of work to understand how you can validate and calibrate that satellite imagery. But I think where we noticed the benefits was that when we got much cleverer and the computing systems allowed to be able to not just compare the classic one image over another and subtract the difference, which is where we started off with, land clearing or burn fire scars, we can become much cleverer. And this is where CyberLabs have done very well in understanding how you can get these algorithms that can actually pull together this information and insert validated ground control points on biomass or ground cover levels, and then using artificial intelligence or machine learning to then build a repertoire that is relevant to the location. So it's a different algorithm or machine learning that is applied in the dry tropics or semi-arid tropic rangelands of Northern Australia versus the Southern Highlands where we are, or Central Australia. So we understand that there are different dynamics. There's different responses to those trigger pulse events of rainfall and the landscape that it sits in. And so, yes, it does require a certain amount of validation, but as we've got much better computing systems, the team at CyberLabs have proven that they can really tighten the accuracy up and can get quite accurate predictions of what that biomass equates to on the ground as we cycle through the seasons. But the other beauty of that is that it becomes much more informative, and those people that have been working in that area, it even gets to the point that you can actually understand the signature and response that you're getting in that satellite imagery. Even though we can't see the individual plant and forb species, you can get a sense for the type of species makeup. If you're, this is where the subject matter experts come in. They understand that on that land, in that type of soil, in that location, and given that time of season and the type of rainfall, you get a very good feel for even what other species composition that you're getting and the response that's within that measurement that you're getting. And even such things as even getting an idea of whether or not is it a perennial or annual based plant composition. So a good question there, Giuseppe, but yes, a lot of hard work has gone into that. And again, CyberLabs have really led the way in how to actually make extra benefits out of this amazing technology and be able to apply it on the ground for real outcomes, whether it's from a research point of view or, equally importantly, for the land managers out there.
Thanks, Luke, for that very comprehensive answer. Next question from Glenys Batchelor. How or are you managing the influx of saline water? So I suppose that's about how I'm managing the salinity aspects that would occur from rehydrating catchments.
Another very good question and very pertinent to a number of parts of our country. Again, it's a combination of things. So if we're talking about, let's just, we all accept that there is naturally salt in our landscape. We've got a very old landscape too. And there's even minor amount of salt even in the rainfall. And depending on how close you are to the coast, there's naturally salt in our water. So how do we manage that? Well, our landscape here, the Australian landscape, actually had already formed a process of how it dealt with it. And one of the key things is that our soils and their clay makeup, and I'm trying not to be too technical here, but effectively, if that soil and the soil profile dries out, the clay particles have less chance to bind and hold that salt. So they become loose, let's call it. And if you do get rainfall, and if that soil is not protected or it erodes, then salt is mobilized. And it can be mobilized across the landscape into the creek, or it can be even mobilized down through the soil profile and further down and collect somewhere. Now that has happened in the natural processes, but that's salt. If we're actually managing our soil well, and the clay and the microbes that are doing their job, that salt can actually be bound and be still beneficial, because we as plants and animals need salt and minerals to survive. There's a certain amount we need. Of course, the old adage of everything in moderation. So the landscape knew how to manage that and make it available, and the plants could extract it where needed. And of course, the animals would eat that and the plant and take up that salt, the salt and minerals. If you've got a degraded system, that's not working anymore. The function of the soil is now degraded, and the salt can become more easily mobilized. From a point of view then that we've heard about, where the water table's moved up and moved the salt up. Well, when you've got a degraded system, and a degraded system as in the hydrogeological system that's working, that's out of balance again. And again, some of our groundwater naturally has this salt. It's sitting in the base rock, or it's filtered down through the soil over the eons. But if we end up that thin layer of topsoil, that if it's actually functioning well with, as it should, from a plant, soil, water functionality integrated, that freshwater lens that you would naturally get in that topsoil that benefits the plant growth, that freshwater lens will naturally, being less dense, hold any intrusion of salt coming up, being forced up by groundwater maybe, that freshwater lens will hold that salt in place. And that way still allow the plants or crops to grow quite well and not interfere. And meanwhile, you're actually making that soil function well, that it also continues to hold or bind the salt and minerals, and the microbes do their job in making them available to the plants as required. So you can manage salt in the system. We've just got to understand how the plants, soil and water work together, particularly in that top 1 to 2 meters where it's critical for plant growth.
Okay, Luke, thanks for that answer. I might add to that, the work we've been doing with the Malone Institute's been looking at effectively the water balance of these catchments and the processes of how water moves through these catchments. It's interesting to note that a lot of these areas used to be prone to salinity, and with the changes in rainfall patterns, that's become less of an issue, with less water held up in the catchments. As you put those dams in place, you will lead to some raising of the water table. But if that's done in parallel with the other works that they're doing, such as letting the vegetation re-establish itself, then you get to a new equilibrium. So it's, in terms of managing that, it is about understanding those hydrogeological processes at the catchment scale as well. And there's a lot of data being collected by the Malone Institute to look at that.
Richard, just on a quick point of correction there, I would prefer that not using the word dams, because there's certainly, I don't want to give people the wrong idea that we've built dams. They are certainly leaky weirs. They're absolutely designed to leak water, not only overtopping them, but to go, to leak through it. It is quite a point of difference, because we don't want to give the idea that these are dams per se.
Leaky weirs it is.
Okay,
Okay, we've got a few questions to get through, Luke, so we better keep
let's go.
moving on this.
Yeah.
Scott Wright asks, can you give more information, re key lines, and how or what resources you use to find these lines? Your words may have been natural land steps and water inputs.
Yeah, good question. Look, reading the landscape is one way of being able to do it. Some people are very clever at being able to do it naturally, like the such of Peter Andrews and Stuart Andrews. I found that from a point of view of looking at using LiDAR, that helped understand where those natural steps are. Other parts are actually being able to understand by even looking for signals of plants and how they interact as a way of understanding where those steps might be. But what it's really trying to say is that these steps can be at a micro scale and also at a macro scale. So a macro scale is the Murray-Darling Basin. There's a whole series of steps all the way down to the Kooyong. There's also smaller steps that even within a paddock, you can have these steps occurring where there's that break and slope. So this is why we say that it is good to go and get the training to understand what it means to read that landscape, look for the features, but also then better still to make sure that you're putting these things in the right place, that you do need to have some sort of capability to do even surveying of a type. And it can be formal surveying or sort of a more sort of backyard style of surveying to understand where the contour line needs to be. Key line is a different style of thing because you're sort of redirecting water, whereas we're trying to spread water laterally. And in doing so, because these are leaky contours, by spreading the water laterally, that you're actually then getting to rehydrate 100% of the country down slope of that whole contour. Whereas if it wasn't there, the water would just run down into the gully and possibly only hydrate maybe 10% of the country. But because you've channeled all that energy into a smaller area and gravity is going to drive that, you then are susceptible to erosion. So it's a combination of things. There's a whole 4-day training course on explaining all of that, and I'm not going to do it justice in 5 minutes. Sorry, Scott, but there is there is some very good information about how you read the landscape, and this is why it's very important to be able to then understand how that adapts to your local environment, and how the plants actually help create those steps. You can even go to a hillside and see how even individual grasses create micro steps. And if they join up, they can create that leaky contour. Nature already does that. There's examples of it. Here, we're trying to fast track that by intervening because we need to try and stop the erosion and the dehydration. And by intervening, we actually fast track the response and the recovery.
All right. Thanks, Luke. Another question from Scott was, does this approach also point to those areas that suffered fires and floods as sufferers of poor land management practices?
With that question, Scott, I think the broad answer, I think that the general broad answer to that is yes. We could always be doing much better land management, vegetation management, etc. Yes, there's also been proactively where just poor land management has exacerbated that. And so my general response is that throughout the catchment, whether or not we're even talking about, and I don't want to just highlight farmlands either, because a lot of our national parks in New South Wales, Victoria and Queensland recently suffered extreme fires, and that's partly because of the dehydrated effects. But it was also about the whole landscape itself had been drained much faster, and that was exacerbated by the extreme drought. So those two things in combination ended up leading to what were very extreme and devastating fires. And so I look at it that the principles, again, whether we're talking about farmlands or even our state parks or national reserves, they all need to be managed with this in mind, and where we can to try and encourage that rehydration, which will actually help promote the vegetation growth. And people are worried about that. That promotes that vegetation growth, with fuels it. But this is where then a combination of, if it is hydrated and there is a level of water in the system, whether it's in the plants or in the leaf litter, that we can actually reduce the severity of those fires. This is why we say we can moderate that. If also that we've got our waterways and our wetlands and swamps that naturally would have been occurring there, they help break up the pattern of just a fire being able to pick up speed and blast through an area. That these green belts or wet zones can actually help slow and retard a fire's progress in building up such energy. So there's a number of factors there, let alone having water in the system that our firefighters and our landholders can utilise. There's many other things there, but also a rehydrated and a system that's creating the biotic pumps, dare I say, it also attracts more rainfall, because we understand enough these days of how plants and the water cycle and the cooling effect of plants actually helps benefit by attracting more rain-bearing clouds to bring rain to that area. A bare ground, hot ground, will actually help exacerbate and reduce the ability or push rain-bearing clouds away, let alone if it does rain, it tends to run off much faster. Hope that helps, Scott.
Excellent answer, Luke. Peter Fisher wants to know, have you any thoughts about how the results from this site might be applied to drier areas such as northwest Victoria?
Yeah, very good question. There's certainly all these principles still hold true. And again, it's about adapting it to those local conditions. I point to such examples that look at very much a similar principle of what we're doing, the EMU project. Hats off to that team over there in Western Australia, and they've been doing work in Western New South Wales, and I believe even in northwestern Victoria. And dare I say it, even the example that for the last almost 30 years now, Wood Green, just north, a large pastoral property north of Alice Springs by Rob Purvis, he's shown that again those principles of water ponding in a very much an arid desert environment certainly has made his property stand out. When I was working in the area from 2000 to 2003 with the satellite monitoring, his property stood out like the proverbial. Now, there's very good examples of how this can work at that local scale, and imagine if we could actually get the community working together, that the benefits could actually be much more extensive. So yes, absolutely the principles can be, and it's about then picking the right plants that suit the environment, to suit the outcomes of what it is you're after, whether it's land for biodiversity and nature, or whether it's for production systems. There is a way of how you can get that system to regenerate, particularly through rehydrations. Activities and actions that can fast track that, and then working with your local subject matter experts to then help you understand what plants will actually then help to build and drive that system.
All right, Luke, good answers there. We've got a couple left to get through, and we've got a very short amount of time. So let's.
All right.
Steve Kimber from, I'm not sure where Steve's from, but his question is, what are the regulatory impediments to these projects? For example, interception of overland flow.
Steve, good question. Again, it really does come down to your state, territory, and even your local government rules and regulations. As an example for us here in New South Wales, it is the in-stream on creeks of a level order of 3 or above are highly regulated. It does take quite a lot of work. We are working with the regulators to try and see how we can get the type of work that we do, get a special sort of dispensation. That's not to say to throw away the regulatory approval altogether, because we do want to make sure it's done properly and not just haphazardly. In terms of across the broader landscape though, and that includes all your ephemeral little gullies or hill slopes, To a large degree, there are the regulatory impediments that you would find in a recognised waterway. But I do always defer to this, making sure that you just check with your local authorities. But broadly speaking, that's our experience here in New South Wales. I think the same is said to be in Victoria. Queensland and Western Australia have slightly different rulings on that. But we always encourage people to look into the local regulatory aspects, tap into some of your local subject matter experts and others that are working in that area to find out what is possible. But broadly across your landscape, you have a fair bit more leeway, and a lot more opportunities of this is where your active production systems are and what you could achieve, particularly if you don't have a creek and a floodplain system.
All right, Luke, excellent answer. Last question. We've just gone a little bit over time, so this is the last one for the day. Thank you very much for all your questions. So Simon Winfield, can I ask about the 60% increase in stock carrying capacity? Has this been achieved with no change in how the stock are managed? Therefore, was rehydration the only change made?
Good question, Simon. I would have to say that it hasn't been able to be totally discerned or separated, the rehydration effects from the land management effects. And what I can say is this is exactly why I'm really looking forward to the research where now we've got all these other landholders that have that are part of this project. And so what we've got now is a range of landholders that practice conventionally or some other or regeneratively, let's call it, and a bunch of people in between on a sliding scale. So this is where we're hoping that as we then change or rehydrate and do these actions down through the catchment, and then we can actually see what is the difference between land use and management and the rehydrated effect. If that's now the constant, as we now extend this through the catchment, we hopefully get very much a better idea of what part of it is related to land use, land management, and the rehydration. But look, the two do go together. It's very difficult to try and separate that. Largely, I suppose, there definitely was a bit of a change in land management, but it was also the fact that it was such a degraded part of the floodplain that it really had, and we were still within drought, that it took a fair bit of time. There was only so much you could still do, but the rehydration effects really did kickstart it, because without that, there wasn't even the water in the system during the back end of the millennial drought, 2006 to 2009, to even really get things going. So it was quite amazing that the rehydration really underpinned that change, and the land management came as a co-benefit once we got plants growing again, and then the careful continued management of the grazing enterprise meant that the benefits then really started to be seen. Good question, Simon. We hope to be able to have more results for you in due course.
All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone. And a big thank you to Luke from the Malune Institute for today's presentation. I thought that was excellent. Feel free to reach out to the Malune Institute or to ourselves if you've got any more questions. And that concludes today's webinar. Many thanks.
Thank you, everyone.